We are talking about two papers, both of them deal with monumental architecture in Chaco Canyon. And so a month ago, if I remember correctly, we were kind of into the sun sites of Chaco Canyon. We've been here a little bit. It seems to me like a couple of months ago, we also talked a little bit about Pueblo Bonito and an alignment, and it's sort of in a discussion of equinox and that kind of stuff. So Chaco keeps coming back. And rightfully so. There's a lot to talk about in the Chaco Canyon and its area and all of the things going on there. So that's really kind of good news. And so when Chris asked me, we sort of looked over the list of things and we said, you know, let's just continue the trend. Let's just do one more September Journal Club, and let's kind of just see if we can do two more Chaco papers, Chaco Canyon papers, and we'll do that. So the ones we've selected, as you guys already know, is Investigation of Solstice Horizon Interactions at the Chacoan Monumental Architecture with authors Andy Moreau, he's on the line, Tony Hull, Kim Malville, Joan Mathian, and Sherilyn Murrow. I don't think I've ever met Sherilyn Murrow, but I see her name kind of on the graphics and things in here, so I'm assuming she was a participant that way. So this particular paper, like the other one we're going to talk about in a minute, the primary architecture by Anna Safar, deals with placement and alignment, if you want, or orientation, but more specifically to orientations purposely built for a horizon foresight. The other paper, I guess we're going to get to second, it kind of is more of a comprehensive overview of both the placement of a site and its orientation, and also its sort of inter-site relationships and all of the lines and sightings and horizon angles and things like that that try to make sense of the build out of Chaco over years. This one also then just kind of really focuses on one thing, not necessarily the if I have this right, and Andy, you certainly, I'll introduce you in a second, you can start to correct me, but not necessarily the which way the building is pointed, but a view from that building site to a horizon. And this one also talks very specifically about the temporal nature of this. So the authors are proposing that there was a shift, there was some sort of cultural shift late in the Chacoan era, and that we find these particular monuments with this particular sort of attribute being built later as opposed to earlier. And so they're pinpointing it to a certain shift and trend that happened later in the Chaco era. So I think that's a kind of a good introduction, Andy. Sort of if you want to kind of, you know, trying to join in or chime in. I do have available to us a couple of just sort of plates or something like that. I chose some of the graphics and things out of both papers to be able to show. And if you'd like, I think I'm going to do the one that didn't come out here. I'll find it and then I'll kind of bring it back again. I wanted to show the graph, the histogram that kind of shows the nature of those the building sites from the past and the future. So let me find that real quick and then I'll kind of call it up for you. So Andy, is that a fairly decent description of what you were trying to attempt with the paper and well, where we're at?
I think it is. Yeah, I think you did a very good job, Rick. You know, to be in brief so that you guys can discuss, and I'm happy to answer questions. This was really a follow-on to the contents of my PhD thesis. And there's another follow-on paper in preparation right now that Joan Mathian and Tom Wines are working with me on, where we're, you know, trying to do a deeper dive on a more encompassing basis into cultural interpretation of what's going on and why we see what we see. But the short answer is that, you know, there are a set of orientation traditions for the architecture that are covered extensively in the thesis and alluded to in the abstract here. Three of them, two of which are sort of emblematic of the San Juan, and one of which I'm increasingly convinced is linked to people coming from the Rio Grande or the Mount Taylor area. And Tom Wines, interestingly, has been educating me about small house sites in the Chaco area, not just within the canyon, but also kind of close in halo sites that that show the same east-southeast orientation. So we've got cardinal directions, south-southeast and east-southeast. But this particular paper focused on, as you mentioned, the calendrical horizon markers. To be clear, there are early sites with calendrical horizon markers. Pueblo Bonito has June solstice rise and set markers. Hongo Pavi has December solstice. Kim Malville some years ago did a topographic analysis, although we never got permitted to do photo confirmation or survey, that indicates that Casa del Rio, west of the main canyon, a very early site that's contemporaneous with Lake Valley and really Pueblo Bonito, also has a December solstice marker. So there are others, but what's really striking in the period after 1100, the so-called Lake Bonito phase, is the ubiquity of the solstice horizon markers and or buildings being built to complete inter-site alignments to the cardinal directions. And then of course, we've got some buildings that do both, right? So just as an example, you can draw a nice straight north-south line from Rabbit Ruin along the west wall of Pueblo Alto, all the way across the canyon to Tsinkletzin. And that cardinal line, you know, is well-defined, highly precise and accurate. And from Rabbit Ruin, you can observe June solstice sunrise. So that's an example of a Lake Bonito site that participates in both. And similarly, Hillside is on the line that I believe Anna originally identified from New Alto to Casa Rinconada, goes right through Hillside Ruin, which is a December solstice set observation point. So that gives you the idea that it's not necessarily an either or proposition. Sometimes these characteristics are combined.
It was the question that I sort of came up in my reading because so I have the graph showing, I hope. Can everybody see the histogram kind of shows the, is that what's, you guys got it? Okay. And so this is, you pulled right out of the paper as you can tell. And Andy, I think this is what you were talking about is these south-southeast and east-southeast, but that's a facing, that's a representation of the way the monument is placed so that you're facing this particular direction, like a directing to that. Whereas the solstice horizon is a totally different thing. There's no reason you can't be east-southeast or east-southwest, east, you know, these, you can't, there's no reason you can be facing these and have some sort of a solstice horizon marker, right? So
that's exactly correct. That's exactly correct. And a perfect example on that left-hand block for the period, and that's very compressed. I mean, we've got early and classic Bonito phases kind of conflated there. The archaeologists would pull their hair out, but the south-southeast and solstice horizon foresight boxes in that case, Pueblo Bonito is showing in 2 of those bars because it has 2 of those characteristics.
And then tell me a little bit more just in this particular context, the intra and intrasite cardinal, just remind me, I think I tried to dig into it in the paper, but what's the middle bar if you want?
Yeah, so the middle bar, this is really interesting stuff to me. So Ray did a lot of the early work on this and probably can speak to it better than I can in some respects. His work at Casa Rinconada, the work that was done at Pueblo Bonito, and we did some resurvey during my PhD research, in large part just to kind of, you know, validate what we could validate. So intra-site is within the context of an individual building. It's the intra-plaza dividing wall within Pueblo Bonito. It's Casa Rinconada. It is, you know, a case where you've got a structural wall alignment or architectural alignment that you can define to the cardinal directions. The intrasite alignments are these lines that you can draw that are based originally on the work of John Fritz, and then Anna expanded the model a bit, and we now have found that the model actually incorporates additional sites beyond what had previously been documented. One of the things we were discussing at the SAA last year and is in the paper that I'm working on with Joan and Tom now. So you see, for example, that I mentioned the north-south line from Rabbit Ruin all the way down to Tincletson, similarly from New Alto down to Casa Rinconada. You've got east-west alignments. It's pretty commonly understood that Chetroketel is due east of Pueblo Bonito. You can establish a due east-west line from Chetroketel to Pueblo Bonito that goes through Hillside Ruin. You can establish a separate east-west precise and accurate line that goes from the front wall of the plaza of Chetroketel through the Chetroketel Michelmo unit to Pueblo Bonito. Penasco Blanco is due west of large portions of Pueblo Bonito. So you've got, in so-called downtown Chaco, these kind of lovely east-west intersite alignments as well as the north-south ones.
So as long as you're
So, yeah.
talking maps, I thought I'd put this up here. So it's sort of like
Sure.
after you sort of explained it.
So
But this comes up a lot.
the line you're looking at right there, right, that originates at Pueblo Alto, it actually extends farther to the north. And there is a
Right.
Lake Benito Michelmo unit a little bit farther up on North Mesa called Rabbit Ruin that participates.
I had
in
not
that
heard of
exact
Rabbit
line.
Ruin. Yeah, I had not heard of Rabbit Ruin before this, but I get it. So it's up north of,
Yep.
directly north of Pueblo Alto. And then this one, seeing Kettle.
One of the real benefits I would point out of having had the good fortune that Joan Mathian and Tom Wines have been collaborating with me and guiding me for some time now, I'm not aware of a single published work that includes the full set of known Lake Benito Michelmo unit style great houses until the paper that we're working on right now. They're just not all documented well. And probably the closest, yes, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. It seemed to me, and I think it relates to this as I was reading it, part of your paper was in some cases making the case that something should be classified as late Chacoan or, post Michelmo, right? I mean, I think there was a lot of description of pottery and things like that where you're having to find it late just because it might not have been before. Is that right?
Yeah, it's true. And to be really clear about that, the entire set, right? So, and GB may want to speak up here too, because he's got a lot of expertise here. But King Cletzo and Casa Chiquita and New Alto and Rabbit Ruin and this full set of sites. There's a Michelmo unit adjacent to Penasco Blanco. All of them, with the exception of King Cletzo, are dated by analogy. Tom's recently been educating me that there are a few timbers they've got dated now from a couple of the others, but that's not really in the published literature. King Cletzo was excavated, and there is a solid base of data for the dates there. Pretty much everything else that's included in this Michelmo family, the Lake Benito great houses that are standalone, smaller scale structures, are dated by analogy based on that kind of rectilinear form, the presence of a single sort of court kiva size, medium-sized kiva, if you will, in the center of room blocks, and those the masonry style. The early and classic Benito masonry style goes through multiple phases, but it's notable for the use of very small pieces of tabular sandstone. If you've visited and seen the buildings, they look like mosaics. It's quite remarkable the amount of effort that went into doing the facings on these walls. The Michelmo units are late Benito structures that are standalone. It's a very different style of masonry, and they've got these big, almost bread loaf sized pecked blocks that are a lot more efficient to work with. And so the room shapes, the overall form, the scale of the buildings, and that masonry form are kind of the primary ways that they date by analogy. And then, of course, there's also, in some cases, the presence of other physical material culture evidence, like varying styles of pottery.
I have one more question for you, and then I'd like to just hear from other people that read the paper. Since you're the author is here, we should all sort of see. And then after that, I'd like to kind of talk about the conclusion a little bit, and then we can kind of move to the other paper and talk about both together. But so this is one of the images out of your paper, and I think there's 4 or 5 of these where you. It seems like what you did is you did your investigations and you predicted a place or a location, and then attempted to get out there on the solstice to capture the actual image of the sun on the horizon. Do I have that order right? Is that correct?
You have that exactly correct. We would
Okay.
usually do preliminary compass survey. Sometimes I would do a preliminary survey with GIS, usually Google Earth and topo maps. And then we would go out and do theodolite survey, integrate that with the ephemerides to do exact same method that Ray used, that Tony Avini used in Mesoamerica. And then subsequently, the reason I've gotten very attached to doing photo confirmation, there are 2 reasons for it. The first reason is that early in the work at Chaco, I started tripping over cases where there were celestial alignments to particular wall structures claimed in the literature that I couldn't duplicate.
Right.
Meaning when we went observationally, said, okay, we're going to go look at the equinox sunset along the west section of Pueblo Bonito's wall, and Shazam, there's no alignment there. It's off. And the other reason is because I would occasionally find the errors in my own data collection as I was learning to do this work. Like, oh, look at this. I'm off by, a couple of degrees because I cleverly reversed my mathematical corrections to go from the edge of the solar limb to the center of the solar disk. And as a result, I'm not where I think I am, and I'm off by a little bit, right? So I've become very attached to photo confirmation. Most archaeoastronomers are not as attached to it as I am, but I'm increasingly convinced that, how shall I put it? I'm suspicious of things I see in print without photo confirmation because of what I've seen in the field. I'll put it that way.
I'm with you, Randy.
Of course, the practicality is you can spend a year finding 14, 15, 20 sites that you want to photo, document, and that only happens once a year, right? How do you get to all the sites and photo document? And that's a practical challenge here as well.
It's absolutely a practical challenge, and it was not inexpensive. I thankfully had the support of many wonderful volunteers, including GB, who's on this call, who did lots of observational and photo confirmation work for me at multiple sites. But, for example, the 2014 season, when this set of images was taken, the total team size was 5 people, and we divided up every morning to hit 2 sites. Okay. And the photo confirmation you see here on the 23rd from Kinsabe, that was actually the 3rd day in a row where we went and sat to try and get photo confirmation. The first 2 mornings we were clouded out.
That was in the paper. I think that description
I forgot.
That problem was in the paper. I saw that.
Okay.
So, but of course, on a solstice, it'll hang there for at least a couple of days. I guess you have it. Then one more question about this, and I'm going to sort of ask members to jump in. So this is pretty distinct. I'm sorry, this is the only picture I copied forward, but this is a fairly distinct sort of thing. You could sort of notice this as a marker, whether it was solstice or not. But some of the other ones looked fairly general, like a fairly flat plane with like a little knob or a knoll or whatever. How confident are you that when you see a feature on a horizon that it is it qualifies as a foresight? I guess that's what my question.
That's a really great question, and I think the answer is you can never know, right? Kim is fond of saying that there's no such thing as a proof in archaeoastronomy. It's not Pythagorean geometry proofs. However, as the set gets larger, my confidence gets a lot better.
Ponderance of evidence.
Exactly. That's the perfect way to put it.
It's a legal term that fits here.
Yeah. Of the set that are in this paper, the one that I would have been the most suspicious of before we started accumulating more data would have been the McElmo unit up at Penasco Blanco. There's the wonderful collection of art that Ray and his team documented many, many years ago that includes symbols that at one point were interpreted as likely indicative of a sun watching station. I know that one of Ray's grad students at one point identified a spot on the mesa edge between that rock art and the Great House where a solstice sunrise was observed against a horizon foresight. From the McElmo unit by Penasco Blanco, it's actually not an individual foresight. That's the one where the sun kind of bisects between a pair of foresights that are very close together. I'm not sure
I
I
didn't
would have.
talk it over, but I'm looking at it right now. I see exactly
Yeah.
what you mean. Now this is
Yeah.
So
I'm not at all sure I would have proposed that comfortably absent the accumulating pile of evidence from all the other sites. But something like Rabbit Ruin, where you've got one small bump on a very, very flat horizon, you know, we saw the same thing at Bissaani in early work. I'm actually more comfortable with that, strangely enough. It may not be dramatic, but when you've got a very flat horizon and only a single mark within, you know, 15 or 20 degrees of horizon, I find that fairly convincing.
Yeah.
anybody else? I don't want to do all the talking, and I've done all the talking.
I
Maybe
just found it interesting a little bit here, that a little bit what you're talking about here kind of relates to the work we're doing up at Escalante with, you know, the difference between orientation and alignment. You said, Andy, you had some buildings that didn't quite, you know, align perfectly, you know, the equinox, but were they oriented in the same direction or close enough to be within a reasonable gap in time?
Yeah, my response to that, Greg, is I continue to believe that it is a probable error of ethnocentrism that we conflate equinox with architectural orientations to the cardinal directions. They're not the same thing.
Right.
One is
Right.
a mechanism where, using a variety of methods, but most likely, although unproven, you know, shadow casting and gnomons, you can get pretty precise east-west walls laid out. I mean, goodness, they were doing it in basket maker times at Shibikashi in the eastern part of Chakra Canyon. They were doing it up and down the San Juan. We see this tradition. But unless you're at sea or in a very flat place with nothing on the horizon, and an equinox sunrise or sunset is not going to line up with that wall.
Yeah, it's
Right. Yeah, it's not going to line up, but it would certainly be helpful to define the time of the middle sun, the season of equinox.
But I'm not sure equinox was a construct.
Right.
Right. I mean, so it may be a bit of a bunny trail. You may recall the talk we had at Arizona State some years back on this whole topic. You know, as I've learned more, that particular area, I haven't really found my opinion shifting very much. The thread of evidence that we have for the importance of equinox in the modern Pueblo world pretty much comes from Tiwa people and Alfonso Ortiz's work.
Right.
And we're talking about a culture that was maintaining performative ritual traditions through centuries of religious suppression by the Spanish, during which time they also overtly converted to Roman Catholicism and took on the Spanish calendar. I continue to believe it's very likely that ancestral Puebloan peoples who had bifurcated social moiety structures, right? Summer people, winter people, there are various flavors, Pueblo by Pueblo, may well have had a timekeeping mechanism that they used, and it was probably tied to the solar calendar and seasonal events. Not to be snarky, but I find it hard to believe that they were informed by the Babylonians about equinox so that they could use that date to keep track, right? So yeah. I think there is probably in the evidence out there somewhere a body of material to be discovered if we can tie sites to Eastern Pueblo ancestral cultures where moiety social structures are likely, and then additionally start to find calendrical markers tied to those sites that begin to establish a pattern or something like an equinox or near an equinox based on day counting or dividing the horizon or the other methods we know of, I would not be shocked by that, but it's not equinox using our Western terminology.
Oh, absolutely. I agree completely. I think, we need, like I said, a much more larger sample set to determine exactly what is going on in these kinds of sites. And I think, again, the Escalante Pueblo example, the southern wall on that is on the peak of Hesperus, which is 95 degrees. And we put equinox just off to the left of that, down the hill there. So the site seems to may not be cardinally oriented the way we think of cardinality now, but it was certainly oriented to the landscape features. And those just happen to be right at those same places.
Yeah, and I think, that is something I have seen less of, but an example that comes to mind of that is Pierre's Acropolis, which is a site on the Great North Road between Chaco and Salmon up to the north, where there's a fairly significant room block there that is very accurately aligned on the mesa down by oh Lord, the name is escaping me. GB, rescue me from myself here. Hosta Butte, I'm sorry. It's wonderfully aligned on Hosta Butte. Do we have a whole set of these that we can make a case with? No. Was it visually pretty convincing? Sure was.
But we're starting to build a case the more we do this cultural landscape archaeology that we're doing.
Exactly.
I think before we jump off of this paper, I have to apologize. I sometimes get confused as where your dissertation ends and some of the later papers pick up. But I don't think, I'm not sure if, this one goes into as much depth as for the South-Southeast orientation family, East-Southeast orientation family, because I think those are equally as fascinating, maybe not as spectacular as, the solstice on the horizon or the cardinal directions, but I think they're equally as important and deserve our mention, especially when we move on to the other paper where orientations of the same buildings are proposed as to minor lunar standstills and things like that. I think it's certainly worth talking about these groups.
I agree, Chris. And one of the things that's really important is consistent interpretive framework, and to be transparent about that consistent interpretive framework, right? So what's the front? You need to make a set of reasonable and then document reasonable assumptions on what the front of a building is to talk about where it's facing. So in general, the rule set that we've used is consistent with material that's more broadly been used by multiple archaeologists long before I started doing archaeoastronomy work, which is, plaza to the front, room block to the rear, the side to side axis generally longer than the front to back axis, taller walls to the rear, shorter walls to the front, and so on, right? And I think being mindful of that and recognizing that the South-Southeast orientation tradition has a pretty big range. The orientations to the cardinal directions have a small, what we would call standard deviation. They're all pretty precise within the same box, or frankly, we wouldn't claim them, right? So we end up hand waving a bit about Hungapavi, which is at what, 4.5 degrees off or something. And is it or is it not intended to be close to cardinal? South-Southeast is a pretty big box of facing directions from 150 some odd degrees down to 170 something. Alden Hayes at one point did some temporal analysis of the sites he was aware of and was able to group them to a degree temporally. And I see some of that pattern in the great houses. He was looking at small house and habitation sites as well. But here's the important thing to be mindful of. With the south-southeast facing family of buildings, when you start having 5 or 10 or 15, or you look across the whole San Juan Basin, you know, more than 100 of these, almost guaranteed the back wall or a bisector for some of those structures is either going to point at a solstitial or a lunar date of interest. I believe at this point, based on the preponderance of data, that that's a selection effect. It's like looking at all of the, you know, houses in a randomly generated suburb someplace that's not laid out on a grid, and figuring out that, you know, some small percentage of them point to a particular aspect doesn't really mean anything. But that's debatable, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, you're raising an important point there. I mean, a general point, it seems to me that we kind of need to be very careful about our assumptions when we look at a set of data like that you kind of really have to step back and ask, does this fit into a larger pattern, for example, and try to understand it from that standpoint. I mean, I think one of the troubles, just sort of backing away from any particular site, is we want to see an alignment or an orientation or something that is meaningful in our sense, and it's awfully easy to stray from reality in that case. And at any rate, I just want to emphasize what you were saying there. I think that's really right on target.
And I think that would be a perfect case. If you guys recall, several months ago, we discussed a paper from Fabio Silva on his new method for his statistical analysis that he put forward for determining, I don't want to say determining intentionality, but I will anyway, just for, you know, we all know what the slippery slope that is. But basically what he's doing is he's taking groups of monuments, in his case, you know, in Europe, but using his method to create confidence envelopes.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And then you can take these sites and, you know, the peak of your statistical analysis above the degree of the confidence envelope, you know, can really tell you if, you know, we are looking at, you know, minor lunar standstill alignments, or if we're just looking at a group that's oriented in the south-southeast direction. I think that would be probably a worthwhile exercise.
Let me jump in for a second, because we got to do a little time check. We've got a second paper to talk about, and I actually think that this little discussion right here is a perfect segue into Anna Sofaer's paper, because her paper very specifically is about wall alignments, where and that's really where I think there's a bit of a departure here, where Andy, you and Kim were sort of like that, focused on that facing direction. She makes the primary wall alignment, as she calls it, sort of the main statistical value of these things. So if we can, shall we shift over and reserving the right to come back and sort of maybe compare and all of those things. Can we talk about Anna Sofaer's paper for a little bit? Is that right, everybody?
Yeah.
In your head, yes. So in her case, this particular paper seems to be she calls it, what does she call it? A synopsis of work completed through a project they call the Solstice Project. And the Solstice Project, I just don't remember the details, but it was long. It was over a decade, wasn't it? About 12 years that they sort of like kept the project going. And she divides the project into 3 distinct pieces. And one, of course, is this discussion we were just talking about, is the orientation of the building. Which way does it point? Or in her case, I think I'll make the case, she's more focused on which ways the wall alignments play out on the horizon. Secondly, then inside those things, angles that she's using, and she's sort of comparing the angles to various forms of phenomenon like solstice markers and major minor lunar cycles. So that's number 2. And then thirdly, of course, the inner site relationships. And so she takes those in turn and does quite a little bit that I have to say, I'm going to share, I guess, one here. I think I think their use of, let me see if I have this here. Their use of descriptions and drawings, I think, is really outstanding, I guess, in the paper. I'm not sure I agree with some of the paper, but this is really an excellent graphic. For example, I don't know if you're seeing what no, wait, hang on a second. I want to share what I'm seeing because you're not seeing it. So I just think this is just an excellent graphic because not only positions essentially the great house where it is in the canyon, but also shows you essentially the shape and the orientation of the thing itself. I love that she did this. And so, but I'm going to kind of just sort of like, let's take each one of these in turn for a second and see if I'm right. Her first characteristic is this sort of orientation thing. And she acknowledges that there is definitely a south or a southeast, south, or and she's acknowledging that there is that. But she seems to be very, very focused on the data, which is actually more like what she calls the primary wall alignment, and then where that hits the horizon. I think there's a table of that here. And so you can see they basically, so here's the thing. She's doing minor standstill at 67 plus or minus, and sort of calling out these particular alignments. So follow my logic here, and then everybody sort of destroy it if you would. It seems like we only have 2 choices here. I'm going to postulate 2 choices. Either you want your building to face a certain direction, and then you organize the wall structures to give you that product, and then that wall structure, eventually that line described goes out to an azimuth. And so that's the facing as the primary. I think what I hear her saying is that these people, they found it important to actually align their walls to certain horizon phenomenon, and then sort of the whatever facing happens is a byproduct of that. Do I have those 2 things right? And are they separate? And am I crazy here?
So my understanding, Rick, is that you've interpreted it correctly. One thing that I will clarify, because I think it's extremely important, and then I'm going to be quiet a lot because I want to hear the group, is that in her work, Anna uses the term sensible horizon, right, which when you dig in really deep, you discover the term we would use in modern parlance is artificial horizon, meaning she's not talking about orientation to a rise point on the local horizon that's visually accessible from that building. She's making the assumption of flat horizons in all directions, which I find an intriguing notion.
She does mention visible horizon, or maybe it's Sinclair that mentions it, some parts throughout. But yes, she's talking about orientations towards a sensible horizon, as if it was, as if we were out at sea, which, is impossible to calculate a declination if you're not.
I'm not going to disagree, but I interpreted incorrectly. And maybe it's just a fast reading, but I was thinking she's using astronomical horizon as for the labeling and the calculation. Here's which way it points. But then putting us, the notion I thought I was reading into the sensible horizon meant what was more important to the location, which would take into account elevation and that kind of stuff. It seems like what you're saying is it's backwards. She's actually not using that. She's only using the astronomical.
In her work, she does not use local horizon elevations.
Okay. Okay. Oh, I misread that.
Yeah.
So, yep, that makes sense. I mean, yeah, it makes sense. It doesn't make sense. So anyway, anybody else about this? I mean, do you see the two ways to look at this? Is there, there's a, I want my building to face this way, and here's how the walls line up, or I want my walls to line up this way, and here's which way I'm facing. I think, you know, I mean, it's oversimplification, but
I think both methodologies from the two papers, I mean, they were clearly approached differently, and I don't want to knock either the methodologies. Using the major axis is certainly something that's been well established by like Hoskins and other people in cultural astronomy from the beginning of what we're talking about. I think far more concerning is the idea of internal geometry.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
I don't mind moving on to that in a minute, because I was concerned about some of that too. But is there anybody else that kind of has just a comment out of this first approach of sort of the building the shape, location, I mean the building orientation, which way it's facing on the site? Is everybody okay with that? Because the next part is, yeah, go ahead.
The one other consideration I would share and ask the group to think about is, how does one go about deciding to select targets? Are you identifying targets and going and hunting for alignments to them? Or are you using ethnographic data to identify targets and then going to see if you can find patterns that are associated with that ethnographic data, which, by the way, is also dangerous because, well, there's more than a millennium of time that is expired between the construction of these buildings and collection of modern ethnographic data, or 19th century or early 20th century for that matter. But one of the reasons that we stuck in my work with the team to use of solar calendrical horizons is because they're extremely well documented in the literature, and the orientation traditions, all three of those were already very evident in the archaeological literature. I would be fascinated if anybody could identify any ethnographic reports from the Pueblo world or anywhere else on the globe having to do with lunar standstills.
Here, here.
Okay, so I think maybe we're going on in the
Chief
same direction.
concerns.
The
Ray-
Adena Hopewell culture, 2,000 years before this. I mean, this is all like a replica of what was going on in, the Ohio River Basin that disappeared around 600 AD and then shows up in some form in the Southwest. I mean, I think that has to be looked at some way. I mean, this is like the lunar max, lunar min. That's like baked into the Adena Hopewell culture. This is not nonsense. They have intra and inter site, alignments. It's just geometry, just roads. Same, very, very similar theology. And what was interesting to me is, in this was like this time shift from this early lunar, what Anna is proposing. That's how I read it. There was like an early lunar. The first 4 buildings in the Chaco were sort of lunar oriented, and then it sort of shifts towards solar or cardinal, or some shift in and even the architecture within the same building. They're shifting over time. I thought that was interesting. And maybe the McElmo is like a later, solar, and then some of the earlier stuff is lunar. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that.
I think what we're hearing is there's not enough evidence, and it remains kind of unproven. And I think you can make a case either way. I know Anna is really interested in this, in the lunar angles. Let me get into this just a little bit. And so you remember her paper is divided into three. One is the orientation of the building. Number two is what she calls intra-site alignments. What surprised me when I started opening this and reading it and looking especially at this chart, she's more looking at intra-site geometry, not necessarily alignments. This doesn't necessarily focus on a structure, a wall, a thing, a site, or whatever, but more like it's really more like the ratio of the rectangle itself, right? A wider, thinner rectangle is gonna, in her chart here, gonna describe different angles, and a stouter, shorter, more like a square-like thing is gonna have different angles. And I think what she's doing here is making the case that those sort of cross angles that happen within a site are a reflection of the angle that a lunar major or lunar minor might be. And so that's a lot to take in, but I'm going to add one more thing to this, because it was Ray was quoted earlier in this thing, and then it comes up in conclusions later in the paper about representational site placement, right? So Ray, I think you were right. I think it was in Casa Rinconada and some of your work, you were not arguing that Casa Rinconada was some sort of an observatory where you could use it to cite things.
No,
But it was built basically with a cosmological sort of framework, translated into essentially Casa Rinconada. So a built environment that sort of replicates what would be sort of a more cosmological understanding. And
yeah, I
think,
see it as a model.
yeah, and I think this is the case she's trying to make here, is not that these alignments point to a moon thing, but the actual framework, what people could understand about these natural cosmological angles could be built into a building. I think that's what I'm reading here, and I think I don't know. I'd like to hear comments about that otherwise. So anybody else get that out of this?
Well, let me just raise a question, and that is, are all of these lines that she's drawing in these structures, do they all fit the archaeology? In other words, we know that, for example, that Pueblo Bonito was built over, that changed the structure of Bonito over time. And so you'd have to ask, what it are the lines in the diagram consistent with the era of construction?
Yeah, the stages of construction as they.
Are you
change.
really, or you?
She doesn't
mixed
use
up-
Pueblo Bonito here, right? So
Yeah, different ages, for example, of different periods of construction. I just want to make a comment, that a general comment, which I found for years, is I worry in a lot of Anna's work and her compatriots in this work, that they come up with a construct and they want to fit things to it. I worry about that.
Yeah.
So it's just that it's, yeah, anyway, enough said. I raised a question about it.
and if there aren't any other comments about this, let me go to the third thing, but let me just sort of leave this with what this left me thinking is that every rectangle, it can be represented by a ratio. Yes, there's a long wall to a short wall, and there's a ratio between the two. And it would be interesting if somebody just did a real quick study of 150 sites to see where that ratio falls.
Interesting.
And there is some sort of commonality or whatever, if everything is if it's likely to be a 3.14 ratio as opposed to anything else.
That would be a wonderful thing to do.
Yeah, it would be
yeah.
a great little exercise for somebody. It wouldn't,
Yeah.
I guess it would be tedious, but it wouldn't, I think there's enough data. Somebody could find it and just go.
Be
look.
interesting. Yeah.
I would agree, absolutely. The other couple of thoughts I would share, mentioning, you brought up the question, Rick, and Ray was really responsive, this notion of the Great Kiva as kind of a model cosmos, that also has very firm ethnographic support,
Yeah.
including the Acoma creation myth and many other ethnographic reports, where I'm not aware of any for this construct. And I do find it fascinating. I always found it fascinating as I learned more about Chaco. Why are the buildings that are in this set on this particular figure here? To Ray's point, they're here because the angles landed into the model. What about all the other buildings?
Exactly.
Something that also strikes me about Chaco is these are all very distinct, different, you know, I mean, you know, some are similar, but every sort of shape, well, I guess I'm saying they're all distinct and different. There isn't a model that somebody built and said, oh, that one works, let's just do this over and over again. They all have their own personality. And I think that's just fascinating about this particular place. One of those other mysteries.
And I thought she made a good point that you know, some going to the different personalities, you know, some are lunar min, some are lunar max, some are solar, you know, they're and maybe that cosmology, you know, moves from house to house, right? So no one's really come up with a good explanation of why all the different houses in Chaco Canyon, right? What was the function, or, you know, if there was one. Talking about cosmology, right? So I think she's got an interesting interpretation of that.
So as we're kind of moving towards the end of the hour, I guess, you know, these things typically go beyond their hours, so I guess I'm not that worried about it, but I do want to make sure that we at least cover the rest of this and then maybe some conclusions. But so the thing number 3 of her paper, as she divides this, is the intersite stuff. And the things I pulled out of it that I thought were kind of interesting, and I'll just throw them out there, is this notion about how much the canyon itself dictates where things are. And this comes up in Andy's paper as well, as opposed to, is it placed there because it's looking for some sort of alignment, or is it placed there because of its juxtaposition to the canyon wall, facing a direction because the canyon wall faces, you know, those kinds of things. And so I see Steve Lexon argues, I think that none of it relates to a canyon wall. And I guess I would sort of try to disagree. I think it just is, it is a coincidence. Nobody built this canyon, so it is a coincidence that the major lunar standstill is essentially the sort of the datum line of the canyon itself. And so that's important. The other thing is that Anna was very careful to point out that even though some of these buildings were built along these very specific lines, they don't necessarily, there isn't necessarily intervisibility between the sites. So so they were she's inferring that, again, there was a cosmological reason for their placement, not necessarily a sighting from site to site, you know, off to the horizon or site to site, because in most cases you can't see there's no visibility between sites. The geography doesn't matter. Anyway, that's kind of the 2 things I pulled out of this one, is just the juxtaposition of canyon and how much it factors in, and the fact that these sites don't necessarily see each other. Anybody else have comments about this section?
Well, I think one of the things that had to be looked at is in the early days is, could all these sites be seen from each other the way they are put in the canyon? You know, was the topography there? And again, we have the meaning of all. Why would they put these sites on these alignments?
Cosmology. They chose that canyon because, I mean, that's the inference, is that, you know, it's a sacred place because it does have that alignment, right? I mean, I think that's as logical as any. I mean, I wouldn't poo-poo that. I mean, it's the same thing happens. I mean, all over. I'm going to go back to the Adena Hopewell. We're talking roads are 40, 50, 100 miles away, but yet they're still on these lines of, you know, some are solstitial, some are lunar, some, you know.
couple of interesting thoughts I would share on that question. One is I completely agree with the question of interdivisibility being important, although certainly not everything. The other is that this view tends to fixate on a subset of the buildings in the canyon, especially later. And so, you know, conspicuous by their absence, one of the things we're working in the current paper I'm working with Tom and Joan on is, you know, where's Casa del Rio? Where's Lake Valley? They were actually bigger than Pueblo Bonito and Hogopavi for the better part of a century, maybe a century and a half. There's a sort of temporally flat view happening in this work that causes me to scratch my head, and always has. Some of Anna's ideas I think are very provocative. Some of her work I rely on, you know, that the visible north side, interside alignments make all the sense in the world. She built off of John Fritz's work there, but you know, the notion of not looking at how things changed in time and instead assessing everything from the end state is an intriguing choice.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got to look at the site visibility over a function of time. You've got to look what sites could be seen from each other when. And yeah, I just, you know, and looking at, yeah, this is a collection of all the sites that are open for visitation to the public.
I want to point out she introduces another element that is somewhat confusing with regard to alignments and so forth, is suddenly she talks about roads and the connection that roads have to all of these sites. And it's sort of like a dangler, but I just thought I'd point that out.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think a lot of times, thanks Ingrid, and it's true. And I think sometimes we call this downtown, I guess, and that kind of thing. But there is a greater Chaco universe here, and those roads I think are and I think it is a really major important feature to this, and the fact that the place is normally ceremonial as opposed to habitat, right? So it's the thing, and that it lasted 300 years. I mean, all of those things are amazing factors about just sort of understanding the total mystery of what we're trying to delve into here. So I mean, these, you know, but yes, you're right. She does introduce it sort of randomly in this because I don't think it was supposed to be part of the paper. And this started out as a defined representation of the Solstice project, which had sort of parameters. And I think that's where she was focusing this paper. But I agree with you. I think roads also are a feature.
I'm going to have to go. I've got a guest here that I'm I'm preparing dinner for. So this is a delightful discussion, and thanks, Andy. I thought your paper was really spot on. Very nice.
Well, thanks for having me, and thank you for the positive feedback, Ray. It's good to finally have a face put with a name.
Yeah.
It's good to see you again, Ray.
Yeah. Well, thanks. And
Ray, I'll see you in a couple of days, maybe, or we'll get
yes,
rained
I
out.
hope so. All right. Well, we'll be in touch, Rick. Thanks. And we also need to decide about the workshop. What are we doing there? Just sorry to jump in there.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think with the response, that's kind of thing we wanted to talk, if everybody would stick around for a little bit after Journal Club, that we are going to probably not cancel the workshop per se, but reformat it into a series of Zoom workshop sessions. That's what we were thinking of maybe doing. We'll probably get together, wanted to get everybody's thoughts on that, and then get together as the board and the workshop organizers and get back to everybody with a plan, because yeah,
that's what I recall. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt the discussion, but I'll see you all later. Thanks.
Yeah. So in general, would those here be interested in a Zoom series of workshops versus traveling to Arizona?
Absolutely.
Guys, I think I'm gonna go ahead and drop as well. And thank you very much for your time and interest.
Andy,
Thank
Okay, Andy, see you. Good to see you. Maybe come back as a member someday.
And that could happen.
All right.
I'm so glad you joined. It really just, it made a big difference to just, this, to bring life
Well,
to the article and that whole process.
I really appreciate the invite and I'm just very happy to see you all. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
All right. Anyway, so with the drop-offs and everything, I mean, we pretty much, kind of talked about each paper. Is there anything in general that anybody kind of wants to add? Maybe it's kind of past the time to dig into the details, but just any big thoughts about these two papers and their approach to sites and site location, site orientation? I guess we've covered everything.
Because we covered it. Yeah, it's like, I think that, like I said, a lot of what these two papers talked about are what we're talking about in the Escalante project, trying to
is.
figure out a way to do cultural landscape surveys where we document the landscape and the dangers of predetermining your biases before you get to the site when you're trying to design a documentation system. So we got to be careful about, when we're designing a system, not to try and build that we're going to find these things into it.
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. And I really, when Chris asked me which ones would I'd like to take as sort of as a host, I was thinking exactly that thing, because we did have a really good review of the Escalante site and used a lot of the same rigor that I said these papers cite, sort of how they go about the practice and how they know their stuff is accurate. And we took on that challenge as well. And it is. It's enlightening, and it should happen everywhere. So I think that's one of the things that I've been drumming all this time is statistics are important, and statistics are informed by numbers. And so if we can get enough numbers and enough information, like Andy was talking about, same approach for every sort of question, then I think we'll make progress in sort of enlightening some of these ideas. So that's my thing. Al, it's good to see you on.
Yeah, it's nice to be here. I didn't read the papers, but
I can tell.
I read them like 2 years ago. So
I would imagine. Are you starting school? What are you doing? Are you?
yeah, I'm in
semester? Is it
school.
rigorous? Good.
No, it's not that rigorous, but that's good too. Slow start.
I think it's great. And Ingrid, great to see you. I'm so glad you're like still on board here. This is good.
Thank you. Thank you. I read the paper. I said, oh, wow, this is pretty good.
And then and on the workshop, would we count on you to sort of join us for some of those? So that we're basically going to take 2 days worth of sort of workshop material and cut it into 4 slices, I think, and just do like hour-and-a-half programs every other week or something like that, just to kind of capture all the things we wanted to capture, but do it in a Zoom format. So we'll see. And they'll be recorded, and then we sort of have them as a resource to back up. That's our plan. Let's see.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I'm going to sign off. It was nice to see everybody. And thank you very much. Have a good evening.
All right. Bye-bye all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you.